Alrighty. Hello. About 6 o'clock here. Okay. So this will be a kind of a half stream recording VOD thingy, I guess, for going over replay stuff, mostly as a kind of example for providing guidance on replay shit in general, as well as a general look at some folks' replays. Did get some viewer submissions like I had hoped, so got some content to work through there. Gonna give just a moment for folks if they're gonna filter in or whatever. Not sure who's gonna be coming by today, no biggie. Okay, audio levels look like they're good. Fantastic. Okay, cool. Alrighty, so gonna start with a little self-introduction here just to get this started. I'm Comrade K. I'm a Canadian fighting game player for about 20 years. I'm doing this stream to try and provide some insight for replay review stuff. This is generally something that I see a lot of folks struggle with in our community whenever I'm talking about improvement or doing any of my coaching stuff. The idea here is mostly to provide a kind of example and talk through my processes for how I go through this. The hope is that this will give people some direction in replay review for themselves. Mostly from my own perspective, granted, this is what works for me, may not necessarily work for others. The other goal here is providing actual replay analysis for a handful of people who've done submissions, so cool. Getting into this, I do want to go over a bunch of stuff before we begin actually going through the replays here, mostly going over the tools and the mindset required for doing replay analysis. This is something that people generally tend to overlook. It's a lot of taking the wrong step out of the gate stuff that people don't necessarily understand because the mindset behind replay review itself isn't super obvious when you're going through it. We'll touch on that as we work here. Just a couple disclaimers before anything. I am not perfect in my knowledge of this game or fighting games in general, so a lot of what I'm going to try to provide for suggestions may not necessarily be correct, although I am quite confident in what I have to say. Most of my views and how fighting games are processed comes through my many years of playing very aggressive fighting games like Guilty Gear Xrd, Melty Blood Actress Again Current Code, as well as Soku as here and the plethora of other games we played, so my generally rush-down aggressive mindset may not function for your character or you as a player. Take everything with a grain of salt. This is more so to try and provide an opinion that may be supplemental to any study that you might do on your own end. Another little tidbit, I am fairly blunt at times with how I speak. I don't mean any harm by what I say, but I'm going to be very upfront with a lot of my criticism or commentary. Please don't take anything as rude, though I will be trying my best to be as polite and helpful and constructive as I can with what I have to say. Alright, so let's go over a handful of important things before we begin. Let's start by looking at the tools that we're going to be using for replay review. The first thing, of course, is we're going to be needing our game client, preferably with a set of training tools that we're going to use. Now, in the case of Soku here, we have a lot of mods set up that make looking through the game very easy. So, for example, if I open up my game here, let's set up into training mode to show out, we have access to a bunch of mods, Replay Input Viewer and Lab Tool. I'll be using a lot of Replay Input Viewer Plus for its features, mainly our hitbox viewer, which we'll be using for displaying hitboxes during gameplay, as well as slowdown functions that exist within Replay Input Viewer Plus. Unfortunately, these functions don't quite work with the most recent versions of ViewRoll. The rollback mod there has a stricter control for frame rate, which does not work well with the replay input viewer plus slowdown, so I will not be using the replay takeover function of the view roll at all during the stream, but that is an important tool that you will need to make use of when you are working on things. So we'll set our back here. We also have Practice EX here, which is another very important mod that will let us set specific situations, things like being able to have our dummy block more specifically as opposed to the default dummy, as well as setting things like air tech, ground tech, spirit gauge functions, etc., etc. That'll be a very important tool that I'll be showcasing while we do some examining of situations as they come up down the line through our replay review stuff. Okay, then, to add on to this, I want to read off a very important paragraph that I usually like to share with people whenever I go over replay analysis, something to kind of get us primed into the mindset of it. One of the main things, as I mentioned, with replay review is you need a very specific mindset to be able to properly go through looking what happened and to dissect gameplays from a very outward-in view. Genki would tend to describe this as looking into the aquarium. This is something that kind of hits very true with these kinds of things, as you need to disengage your personal view of your gameplay. A lot of people will describe that a big difficulty with approaching replay review is they're afraid or they cringe at their own gameplay. This is largely self-destructive, as you need to be able to look at your gameplay very platonically, scientifically, and break down what happened without feeling anything particularly strange about it. You need to be able to recognize mistakes and problems in your gameplay without having that feel negative or believe that it reflects poorly on you. Mistakes are a learning opportunity rather than something to be feared. Mistakes are not death. So, we'll begin by reading off this paragraph here to get us started here. So, we're going to reading this from a Melty Blood mumbling page that I've saved over the years, something that has contained a lot of very useful beginner information. So, Part 0, the mindset. Every decent player will tell you that the correct mindset is everything. A poor mindset on even an otherwise brilliant player will bring him or her down or astray from improvement. For example, consider that you just watched your first footage of a character that really interests you. Okay, you watched a match. That was cool. There was a combo into a mix-up, and there was a reset, and then boom, kapow, they won. Now watch it again. Correctly. What do I mean? I mean, don't be a passive viewer. When you are casually watching a TV show or movie, you are a passive viewer. You need to take the progressions on face value, and you don't really... You take the progressions on face value, and you don't really think about why certain things happen. Easier said than done. But try to think about why a situation occurred. Why was the opportunity there? Look at the life bars, the meter, the timer, etc. Think about the moves at both characters' disposal. Was there something else that could have occurred? What allows the offensive player to do what he is doing? What frame traps or option coverage are applicable? Could there be a better response to that situation from the defending player? Overwhelming, right? But you need to slowly adjust into this mindset. Don't try to take this all in at once. Focus on an aspect that you need to work on, and try to see how a player handles that aspect and why. Always ask why, and always think about the answer to why. Rewind often. Use HTML5 slowdown function for YouTube. The year is 2015. Oh god, I turned to dust. We have the technology. So I like to highlight this paragraph, this entry here, because it highlights the main focus of replay review. You must be an active viewer. You must always be thinking and asking questions while watching replays. While we go through the 2 replays provided, and potentially a third, I will be taking moments to stop and ask questions about what's going on, etc., etc. Up in the corner here, I'm going to have a little notepad where I'm going to be writing down notes or questions or things that we want to think about while we're playing. So, with that out of the way, we're going to move on to our first replay for the session here. So, here in the top. So we're going to start with a replay submission from Cana. So, Cana is a South American player who's been popping up in the 12.13 server recently, and they provided a replay of Alice versus Sakuya. Their entry notes were very, very flowery, so I'll condense it mostly down to the important bits here. The main question or concern is that they are not sure how to play Alice. A lot of what it seems is just not really understanding neutral or how to function in defense and how to better approach these situations. So with that in mind, let's put this in our notes here. All right, so that's our main start point. This is the focus that we want to begin with, but we might notice other things as we go on. So without further ado, let's begin with our first replay here. Pause the replay. We will slow down a little bit, put our hitbox viewer on. Let's start our notes here with round 1. Okay, and let's begin. So round start. Okay, so round start here is kind of important to look at. Cana's decision making before the round even begun proper was to do a lot of air movement and to start in the air. The first question I would have for Cana is, why did you choose to be in the air at round start? The main reason why I asked this question is because the Sakuya player had a very clear opportunity to simply jump and put themselves in a better position above Cana in this contest. Generally speaking, in round start, you want to fulfill some kind of objective with your movement. Now, this differs from certain traditional fighting games where you are in a fixed position on round start. In those games, your round start is generally choosing an option that covers the safest and most options your opponent has for that initial poke, or choosing a defensive option like a backdash or movement to get away from potential danger if you don't have good responses. In a game with pre-round movement, you are more focused on trying to get a positional advantage over your opponent to give yourself more space to either set up your neutral or to be in less danger from your opponent's initial options. I see this a lot in Melty Blood, where many players will often make very aggressive, hyper movements during the pregame that an opponent paying attention can simply start with an anti-air or just block and be patient. This happens similarly in Soku, where a lot of players simply choose to move around for some reason. They see other players, higher players, doing a lot of movement on round start. Those players generally have a very clear objective with their movement. They are either trying to directly put themselves above someone, or they are trying to maybe get into an awkward range where they can have better round start options. So something that I would point here is maybe consider being more mindful with your movement. So let's continue here. 5A, jump. Alright, so here's another one we can point at from right on the gate here. Sakuya has access to projectiles that will bounce off the walls, and this is something you have to keep in mind all the time whenever you're dealing with this matchup. In this situation, because Sakuya was facing the wrong way, she could throw projectiles at the back wall, have them bounce, and then follow up with an air option. Generally in that situation, jumping is not a great idea because you don't quite have as fine control of your movement as you do on the ground. It's a very important thing to know about movement in Soku, and something that I think is really worth highlighting already this early on. Air movement is good, but you don't quite have as fine control of it as you do on the ground. For example, while you can only move horizontally, you have much more granular decision over where you want to stop, where you want to move to, and how much you want to graze without consuming spirit. And that's a very critical part both of positioning and of spirit management, because spirit management is very, very important in this game for both defense and offense. A very critical thing to keep in mind. The decision to jump there without really doing much is kind of a... I'm not really sure what you did there, but I'd have to ask you directly to try to get your mindset on that. So let's add a note here. Much cleaner. Okay, let's add that as a note. Let's move on here. So an air tech into a good button. That's good. That's a good option for trying to catch an anti-air. Neat. What do we do here? We all set? That's not quite Okizemi. Unfortunate. We had a good dulse. The dulcet. Bad Liusem. Okay. Also want to highlight that. That's a good keep out poke. That's totally real, especially with the bullet cover. Thumbs up. Projectile, we jump over the Sakuya. So we have another, we misalign the J5A, that's twice now. But again, good far 5A. That's good. So something to think about in that situation, instead of air dashing forwards, you could have simply gone to ground and ground dash forwards, or potentially done a far 5A to try and counterpoke the Sakuya throwing a projectile. May not have necessarily worked in that context, but it's important to note that being in the air isn't necessarily always a great idea because you don't necessarily have good control over your situation. Dash again. Good air button. Dull set. Dull set. The dulls aren't contested. Okay, we're jumping back. Why are we jumping back? Jump into the corner. Why are we backdashing? Probably just not recognizing the situation. Unfortunate. We whiff far 5A at point blank. Okay. Good jump. Nothing. I think the replay might have desynced. Okay. No, okay, I think it was just maybe a little moment. Okay, alright, let's keep going. Good far button. Dull set. Yeah, I feel like the replay might have decent. Here, let's pop that and let's retry that. How unfortunate. So desync to the mountain vapor, very expected thing with replays. Yeah, this looks correct. Okay. Alright, slow that down again. Yep, okay, this looks correct. Alright, awesome. Air tech. Yep, that's normal. The air button. Good hold of space. Alright, so we have delay knives from Sakuya as an ult skill. Okay, good keep out. We have dull set. What do we do? Okay, we get tagged by 6C. We block. We jump. So I want to highlight something over here in the frame display here. In that situation, you were +9 for blocking, I believe that is Sakuya 66C, if my memory serves correctly. In that situation as Alice, you absolutely could have mashed on that, and given how the Sakuya player didn't seem interested in spell card canceling that one, I would definitely consider trying that. Something really important to note, especially with offense situations like that, is you shouldn't necessarily let the fear of being punished stop you from trying, unless your opponent is very consistently good at showing you that they are willing to try and punish you for taking an action. This is something that I often have a little funny back and forth with when I'm playing with certain players who are very good at presenting situations where they're negative, but they'll do a super to try and catch you on trying to punish them. That will happen, but unless the opponent is willing to show that they are consistently able to and willing to do it, sometimes just punching someone for making a very risky play like that is very worth it. So something to consider here. So let's add this to the notes here. Add that to our notes here. Try recognizing and punishing frames more often. Alright, let's move on here. Good 5A into nothing, unfortunately. We get tagged placing the doll. Okay, unfortunately. So I think in that specific situation, you would have wanted to do Alice 66A to convert off of there. I'd have to lab that to double check, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer for getting something. Alternatively... no, I think just 66A would have been your option, but I'd have to lab that to double check. Okay, so we up back, and we get hit for it. So this ties into my earlier point about cleaner movement. There is a lot of... This is a very common thing that players will do, where they will up back habitually. PC Volt made a very good video that is in the resources channel in the 12.13 server called Up Back is Not Playing Neutral. And I would recommend giving that video a watch, as it kind of highlights the important part that jumping back is giving your opponent space and time to react to things you are doing. When you are giving up space, you have to re-travel that space in order to do things. Or in the case of here, your opponent can simply high jump forward on reaction and J5A without needing to really worry about any kind of retaliation. Just because you can high jump cancel a situation doesn't mean you always should. I like to highlight this whenever I play with folks, that I will simply do things like far 5A, 5B, and stay on the ground. I will fire a 5B and stay on the ground. I will do nothing and stay on the ground. Being able to work with and control ground space is a very, very critical thing in Soku. It is required in order to be able to establish good air offense. Being able to stop an opponent from jumping into the air makes it easier for you to be able to jump into the air. Something to keep in mind. I'd have to probably have a far more targeted discussion about air control and movement, but that's probably something for another time. We'll just put a pin in that as something to keep in mind. Again, putting more emphasis on your movement could be cleaner. We should probably look at that and see what we can do about it. So we air tech, border escape, that's alright. Unfortunate. So this is a situation where I would definitely point at recognizing that catfish was used and knowing catfish. I get the impression that you probably haven't dealt with catfish very much as you played the game. It's a very real option for a delay low that will throw you off guard if you're not paying attention for it. You have like a second or two, if memory serves, to get in the air or low block the catfish, if I remember correctly. You mainly want to jump, and especially in that situation, you had the perfect opportunity to try to jump to get out of the way from it. Just something to keep in mind in the future. Alright, so that is our round 1. Let's take a look at round 2 and see what we can note here. Okay, so we just air dash at the Sakuya player to deal with that. This is another situation where I would point and say, you could have gotten far more mileage out of that by doing it along the ground. This is something I'll probably put a pin in that will pop into the lab after this. I'll put a pin on that there, explain grab movement and why it's strong. I'll show you some examples specifically with Alice to try to get the point across here. So let's move on here. Yep. Alright, so your first part there was extremely good. The chicken block. This is a super, super, super good defense technique. Really happy to see you do that there. If a Sakuya is just sitting back and hitting far 5A, you can absolutely just chicken block out like that. However, you make the mistake of not only jumping back, but immediately going into J5A, which the Sakuya player can also just jump and block and be perfectly safe. I would recommend in that situation, try jumping forwards instead. That puts you behind the player, which, if they're already committed to a button, forces them facing the opposite direction. You have a positioning advantage in that situation. That's good stuff. You can also, alternatively, just reset and jump back to neutral. It's very real. Sake is doing the parry. It's a good thing he didn't bite there. Okay, that's good. All set. We get anti-air tagged. That's something that... This is something that I would probably point at as if a Sakuya player is in neutral and they are below you, I would always be prepared to assume they are going to do 2B and anti-air you. It's better to not sit in that dead zone diagonally upwards to a Sakuya if you can help it. The safest places, generally, if you're in the air, is directly above her. She doesn't quite have options that specifically reach there. Asterisk. Alternatively, try to stay on the ground more often. I promise it's a lot better than you might think. Okay, back dash, we get tagged by the knife. That's another one right there. We are forward dashing and super jumping when we don't need to. In that situation, dashing forwards and using 3A might have sufficed more, as 3A is a very solid anti-air option that Sakuya has, and that does put you crouching. I think in that, if I had replay review, we could replay takeover, sorry. We could probably double check that and see if that would work, but I would put a point on that here. Let's add that on the notes here. Let's try that. Add that to the notes. Air. All right, we air tech into getting hit. Let's put another tidbit on that there. Let's point out here, not air teching recklessly. This is a very critical thing that a lot of people tend to struggle with when it comes to defense. Air teching isn't necessarily bad or wrong, but you need to know why you want to air tech. Air teching when your opponent is directly on top of you isn't necessarily a safe idea because you are giving them a very large audio cue to push a button to try and stop you from getting out or counter-pushing a button. Surprisingly, it's actually a very good idea to take the knockdown sometimes and utilize your ground tech because you can cover far more ground in those situations, especially as a character like Alice, where you have a pretty long-reaching ground tech that will give you a pretty good safety net. Now, granted, yes, you could potentially eat a projectile on Wake Up. Alright, cool, super jump on Wake Up. Or just block it and don't worry about it. If you're worried about taking Okizeme, I will point out that taking mid-screen Okizeme isn't super dangerous when you understand defense, because mid-screen offense in this game isn't particularly scary outside of a handful of characters that will make you have to work for it. But those are exceptions rather than the rule. You should be playing to the rule of don't air tech out of the corner, don't worry too much about blocking mid-screen. Okay, so we air tech out and C. We just simply take far 5A. So that's a little moment of familiarity there, of just not knowing that the delay knives have no box when they come out. Something to just keep in mind for the future if you ever deal with that option again. So we jump, we take a far 5, we take a J5A. 6C, we dash through, we trade. Could have probably taken that better. Okay. Doll. Boomerang. Alright. So that's unfortunate that we didn't recognize that the knives were coming. That's just a thing to point at in the future. If you ever know that there's a projectile on screen, you want to make sure you have the object permanence to know that that thing's there and it's probably coming in your direction at some point. Okay, again, another reckless air tech that got you killed there. Reckless air tech. Nash, F5A pretty recklessly, and we die for it. Unfortunate. So that's another situation right at the end there where I would definitely point at maybe utilizing 3A would probably be a better option going forwards for when you're dealing with anti-airs like that. So let's take a moment to examine that pin I made about movement. So let's hop into practice mode here. Let's take, let's see, is my stick gonna read? Nope, unfortunately not, that's okay. We will simply grab Alice here. Alright, so let's focus on what I mentioned here with ground movement. So the main thing to keep in mind with ground movement is that you have pretty good control over where you want to move. In the air, you have to deal with momentum. So when you air dash like this, you have to deal not only with your initial spacing and the dash move, but you have your entire downwards arc falling to the ground with your momentum, as opposed to ground dashing from the same space. Very small, granular decisions. You can also pick maybe a little bit further, maybe really far, depending on the situation. We can also do something where we cancel our movement here with a bullet. This is really good for Alice, especially important. You can do dash projectile, so dash 5C, dash 2C, dash 4C. You can use this as functionally as a break. You can stop your ground momentum to place a doll and get projectiles out. So doing something like forward dash 4C, or 4A, 4B, holy shit. 4C? Whatever. This is something that Genki and I talk about a lot when we point out movement to players, is that you can stop your momentum while dashing with projectile options. I like to make this kind of analogous to FD stop in Guilty Gear, though it's not quite the same tech in utility. But it's different than simply letting you stop, as you don't have that moment of slowdown, deceleration, where you can't really do something. Now granted, it's important to note that while you are decelerating from dashing here, you can block. So simply holding back while you do that is perfectly safe. Dash blocking is a very good technique in fighting games in general, and it's very good in Soku. Now, the other thing to note about the movement thing is pointing out the spirit consumption thing. When we dash in the air, we consume spirit. We go through a lot of that depending on how far we go. In one of those exchanges with the Sakuya player, you chose to simply do this to blocking. And that already puts you at a fairly large spirit deficit, which made it harder for you to get momentum back when you were out of spirit. This gets into, as I'm going to repeat myself, the critical aspect of spirit management. Not overextending yourself through air movement, and not overextending yourself through projectile usage. Now granted, Alice needs to set dolls, that's very important. You want to make sure you're reserving your spirit for those situations. And especially since you have access to very good keep out buttons in FAR 5A and 6A. These are the things you want to be using grounded for the most part. They also have the property of having a pretty high box that will clip a lot of opponents who do low angle jump in options. You'll see a lot of Aya players explode to this kind of thing, where you simply just hold space and push FAR 5A or 6A when you see them jumping. Specifically, FAR 5A is the easy one, but 6A generally can work for a slightly taller box. And as mentioned, you also have 3A. This puts you in a pretty good crouching state, which lets you kind of duck under a handful of projectiles, as well as giving very, very large boxes in the air in that specific diagonal spot that a lot of players love to air dash at you at. Now, the important thing to note about 3A with Alice is that it is air blockable, but you shouldn't let that stop you from using it, because if the opponent air blocks it, their momentum is completely halted. They are pushed back, and they are no longer able to get in on you unless they either take a new air action to try and approach, which you can then 3A them a second time, or they try to do some kind of projectile option, which, for the entire cast, has a notable startup that you can react to. Something like ground dashing forward through to go under them, or perhaps super jumping to hit them with, say, like a J6A, or something like that. That's something you're going to want to consider. So I hope that makes sense for you when you review all of this conversation. If necessary, we can do a more one-on-one thing down the line and talk about it specifically. But I think that covers most of what my observations for that match was. For the concept of neutral and defense there, I think it's mostly just not establishing yourself very effectively, not making sure that your opponent has to respect your presence, which is a very important thing with Alice. Given how she entirely lives or dies based on her doll placement and the ability to control space, it is super, super, super important that you make extensive use of your keep out tools, your fast options like 6-6A and your 4A when required. Mainly your 6-6A for things to reach kind of slightly higher up. 6-6A is faster than it looks, I promise. It's a pretty good option for poking out. As well as making sure that you are putting your dolls in spots where your opponents can't immediately break them. Now granted, the Sakuya player you played didn't have the presence to destroy your dolls when they went on screen. But I imagine if you were to play with someone who understood that a fair bit better, you would definitely feel the struggle far more. But that's probably a discussion for another time that we can have a more targeted talk about that I'm not necessarily prepared for at the moment. So that is that. I think that covers all of that. Alright, so let's move on to our next replay here. This one is from Liusem, who is a pretty fun Remelia player. Played with him a couple of times. So let's look over here. We're going to go for Liusem's notes here. Alright, so from the notes that was sent to me, the focus of here is wanting to use Remelia's kit a bit more often. Specifically mentioning that people have noted that Liusem does not necessarily use the core strength of Remelia particularly well. Funny enough, this actually ties into a bit of a conversation we had before the stream here on a call briefly, where I was talking about Remelia players not necessarily using things like Demon Lord Walk effectively in neutral. We might see some of that here, and I can kind of talk about that a little bit more as we go. So, let's begin with round 1 here. Pause, we'll slow the game down, put our box viewer on, and let's get to it. So, round start, the Sakuya player is jumping around a lot, and Liusem is holding space until they also super jump to get out of the way of taking a J5A. This is the reverse of the situation that Cana dealt with. Holding space instead of recklessly moving around to be prepared to respond to something that happened. Good. And unfortunately, we eat the anti-air 2B. The J5B whiffs. Eat a button. Projectiles. Okay, so we ground dash instead of trying to establish control of neutral. Okay. Block. Jump. Okay. Okay. Let's see if that situation happens again. We jump, we block. Trade. Get hit. Neutral tech. Hold space. Okay. Convert. Nice. Okay, we get tagged despite trying there. Alright. Good Demon Lord Walk. That's very good. That was a very good get out of the corner situation. See. We dive. We miss the follow-up, unfortunately. We wait. We dash in. Block. Wrong block. Hit. Unfortunate. So, something that I've learned from talking with Daka Wolf, if you ever are in a situation blocking Sakuya like this, it's safer to assume that she's going to fire out the low than to try and guess for a high. Generally, she gets a much better reward off of a wrong-blocked 6A than anything else. Whiffs, we walk out of the corner, unfortunately. So in that situation, I think perhaps doing an anti-air 2A would have been the better option there. Trying to think. Yeah, an anti-air 2A in that situation definitely would have been a better decision there, as just tapping your 5A was kind of not the greatest idea unless the Sakuya player decided to just drift the whole way down, which I would generally assume they're probably going to push a button because they are a Sakuya player. Okay, so there we go. So that's a thing there. I would point out, this is a situation where you are grounded, the Sakuya player is off the ground. This is prime Demon Lord walk territory. This is something that is going to absolutely fucking bonk someone who is sitting at that angle, not actually holding the ground. Against someone on the ground, Demon Lord walk can be very scary because, well, they can just block it and counterattack. Sure, that makes sense. However, if the opponent is in the air like that, they still have to deal with being propped up back from the block stun. And you generally, I say generally with like air quotes, there are situations I imagine the Sakuya could 2C to try to punish it from that situation, but I'd have to see the specific frame data for that. That generally gives you a safer situation. I would point out what I mentioned in the call earlier. Using Demon Lord walk more often instead of 6D might get you a bit more mileage, especially when you are dealing with players who are very absent-mindedly just throwing out projectiles, which this Sakuya player kind of seems to be. They're doing a little too much on just kind of throwing stuff out. Sweet. Okay, we get Hongeki'd. We neutral tech. Okay. So something I want to ask is, why do we neutral tech so often? There's a lot of generally speaking, good defensive play is to try to tech to mid-screen so that you don't have to deal with corner offense, if at all. I would need to know exactly what your logic is behind, like, neutral teching in a lot of spots, because, like, near corner, I'd say, I think twice now, if not 3 times, you have just neutral tech rather than popping out the corner. In this specific situation, by just neutral teching, you were forced to block the knives, especially because the threat of the Sakuya in the air moving at you would keep you locked down. So land cancel, we block it properly, we jump, yep. Unfortunately, we don't push the button above. Need a combo, okay, we take private square, what do we do? We back tech. Alright. So this is something that I've also learned from playing with Daka Wolf. When you are dealing with private square, it's generally better to tech to mid-screen, as Sakuya mid-screen pressure is far less oppressive during private square, and you will have far less of your spirit burnt. So this is specifically like a very Sakuya thing. So let's put a note here for this one. A couple notes to catch up here. So often tech to mid-screen more often. Yeah, let's write it like that. Tech to mid-screen more often. That's something that I would definitely point out as an issue here. Okay. So something I want to point out here is, let's see if I can pull up the frame data for it. Where is it? Demon Lord Cradles, startup 14 frames, 17. Okay, versus Demon Lord Walk, having startup of 17 frames. Okay, so something potentially to keep in mind going forwards, if you are capable of recognizing it in the future, is maybe if you are in a situation where you see a Sakuya charging a 6C at you point blank, consider trying to do something like Demon Lord Walk to blow through it. So I believe this one's just gonna double check here. I'll have to probably lab that to double check if it actually works there. Alternatively, border escape on that to just get out and try not to have to deal with that situation. A Sakuya player should not be charging a 6C in your face like that without exploding, especially as Remelia. So let's see, bullet moves 6C. A charge 6C is 38 frames startup, so you could probably just smash on a 5A or far 5A if you were capable of. I believe your frame data... Yeah, so I imagine you were probably getting mental stacked in that situation and you weren't necessarily thinking of having to block a 6C like that, which totally real, I understand you. But if possible, if you ever see a charge like that happen in your face again, consider hitting a button just by reflex, as no charge move is less than like 30 frames, I believe, in the game, 20 some to 30, and all of your 5A startup stuff is going to just fucking bonk that. Yeah, I think that would be something to look at there. Okay. I want to see, what was your shoot, can't see the input there for what's going on. Should have the input view up. Okay, unfortunate, but okay. Dash through. Fine. Okay. So, I wanted to see how it would go into the next round, but I think a very, very important thing to note is you're not making use of any of Remelia's projectiles particularly much. I think this is probably something folks were implying when they were mentioning you weren't necessarily using her kit. There's a lot of times where you just wait, and your entire plan is to dash in at someone or utilize movement rather than trying to force them to do something and react. I would get the impression that it's probably because you've frequently been getting hit when trying to use projectile options, which shouldn't really be something you let dissuade you from engaging that, because a character in Soku without using their projectiles is largely ineffective. You see that with a lot of people who pick up characters like Mei Ling, where they just don't necessarily engage with her 5C options to do anything because they see big slow projectile that doesn't go very far. Clearly it's not very helpful. I would probably put a focus on at long ranges, taking advantage of using like 214, yeah, D214 for putting a bunch of bats on screen, or 5C. I've seen you use your B options a bit. That is definitely like a fast check option that I would consider using whenever your opponent is very consistently doing like slow options, or you need to counter poke with projectiles in some cases. Especially since it's a semi-randomized shotgun spread, you can poke through a few characters' projectiles to tag them. Yes, projectiles aren't necessarily Remelia's strength, but by simply not using them, you are leaving something very important on the table that's going to make your opponent have to respond to options you have available to you. So let's add here, use often / it's what projectiles serve which purposes. Alright, let's add that to there. Let's move on. Okay, so again, I want to point out that would have probably been a very good Demon Lord walk situation, as the Sakuya player was low to the ground firing projectiles. I want to reinforce this from personal anecdote from Remelia players I've gone against in the past, where I will do my very head empty 5B or low to the ground J2B stuff, and they will simply just Demon Lord walk on reaction and shut me down for that. That is super important in trying to establish your space and hold your position. If you don't do that, opponents are going to keep doing this, where they'll simply just like kind of jump at you, stay low to the ground, and fire a projectile because they see you're far more afraid and want to block it rather than flipping them the middle finger and beating them up for doing something super dangerous. Okay, good hit. Nice. So we set 214D. And then we do, unfortunately, we do nothing. In that situation, you had plenty of space to either jump air dash in, ground hop in, or be Demon Lord walk and use the bats for safety. Something very important is just not taking advantage of the potential Okizemi that having a slow-moving projectile on screen with a movement option presents. Okay, so we hit. Okay, we grab it square. We neutral tech instead of teching to mid-screen. Again. Okay, we border escape forwards. Nice. See? Good border escape catch. Confirming to some damage. We do nothing. Okay. Okay, good crush. Okay, that's nice, good conversion. Okay. Good dash. Good. We get tagged, unfortunately. Tech to neutral, but then we get punished. We tech to mid-screen, good. DP, good. Get tagged. Neutral tech instead of keyboard walk out. Good walk under, very good walk under. Unfortunately, we don't get a conversion. An air movement for nothing. We hold space. We get tagged. Okay. We're burning spirit quite a lot. We get guard crushed. That's another situation where I think doing a 2A anti-air would have absolutely been the play. I think that's something I might want to push you towards doing, is if your opponent is low to the ground near you, push 2A more often. You pretty consistently have just let the Sakuya player jump immediately on top of you. So just something to think about. Here, add this to the notes here. 2A more often to anti-air. There, you see? Right there, right there, right there. I'm pointing at that and making the face. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Big thumbs up. Fantastic. And we convert into damage. Nice. Okay, we set bats. Don't get much for Okizemi. We trade. We jump to get rid of the knives. Good. Step back, jump forwards, chain gang. Okay, did we do much with it though? Okay. Block. Okay, so we're very clearly afraid right now. We don't want to die, so we're holding back and firing off chain gang. What exactly is this achieving? That's the first question I would ask here. What is our objective by sitting back and firing chain gang and not engaging? Are we hoping the opponent's trying to kill themselves on us? Alright, good 2A. Okay, good 2C. Just doing max range chain gang here. Okay. Convert into damage. Air tech's out, no Okizemi. Good anti-air bullet. We chain gang there. Why did we do that? Okay, again, I want to point out, if you ever block Far 5A, 6A is exactly what's coming in your direction. She has no high option off of that. So if you ever wrong block and take the there, just stay blocking low. Unfortunate. Unfortunate. Okay. Okizemi set. We tech into the corner. You gotta tech out of the corner. You need to tech out of the corner versus Killing Doll. Okay. You just do Chain Gang. Okay, charge 5C. Dodging properly. Okay, good. Good anti-air, but we whiff the follow-up. Okay. So I want to put some emphasis now that you're using the dive a little bit more often. You are using the dive fairly correctly as a little bit of a momentum shift and a way to try to catch and whiff punish stuff. That's pretty good. Because of how Remelia flies backwards like that, unless the opponent is willing to commit to their own dash option, I believe some characters can punish that with 6-6C, it's pretty safe. You should probably use it more often until the opponent is more willing to show that they're willing to try to punish it. Because you will absolutely catch people and force them to have to guess on those situations. Alright. So that's the one time Chain Gang finally worked. So, something to note with Chain Gang, the main reason why it works is that it's very good as a counter snipe. If you are using it to catch your opponent, who is very willing to just do high commitment projectile options in neutral, it's a fantastic catch. However, if they're simply moving around or just firing weak, low commitment projectiles and not really engaging, Chain Gang is not going to do anything. And that's something that a lot of Remelia players seem to struggle with, is you are mostly hoping that your opponent is going to hang themselves on Chain Gang rather than actually using it surgically. So I would consider re-examining why you have Chain Gang in your deck and what purpose it actually serves for your playstyle. So let's add this to notes here. Yeah, let's examine why we use Chain Gang and what it brings to the table. Let's move on. We confirm, off screen, unfortunately we whiff it. We jump, we avoid, very nice. Dash. Okay. Good evasion. Chain Gang explosion. We get 6-8, unfortunate. Okay, private square, what do? Tech into the corner. Where we have to eat the scary offense on soku. And we are very scared, so we eat another charge 6C. And that's that. Alrighty. Okay. Yeah, that... Okay. Okay. I think that paints a pretty clear picture, in my opinion, so... I forgot to separate the rounds here, so round 2. Yeah, okay. So that's largely what I would pin as the main thing here, is not really taking advantage of Demon Lord Walk, which is a very good neutral skip option. You are, more universally, you aren't teching to mid-screen as much as you probably should. Sakuya doesn't really have too many super scary cross-up options. She just has pretty basic Okizemi, unless she's very willing to sit at your tech spot and try to get you with the tech position collision 50-50. If she's not doing that, don't be afraid to tech out of the corner more often. That's gonna run you a lot more mileage. Your projectile usage pretty much doesn't exist for the most part. It got a lot better in the second round there. I think that well, it's the third round really, you were a lot better with using your projectiles, but you could have done it far more early on and far better later on. Mostly because it doesn't seem like you quite have a grasp on what specific role those projectiles are trying to serve in your kit, which we can probably sit down and have a look at that and try to give you some guidance on how you would go about that. Next, I would point out the anti-air situation is something that definitely is important. Not correctly anti-airing when your opponent is low to the ground immediately near you or even slightly higher. To kind of expand a bit more on it, you were doing very good in that third round where you were trying to 2C anti-air fairly often. That's a really good decision when you are dealing with an opponent who is throwing a lot of weak projectiles as a means to try to poke downwards at you, especially when they're higher up in the air, because 2C kind of has a bit of a recovery to it, so it's really nice for just trying to establish a kill zone that your opponent can't easily hop onto. But at the lower angles, doing 2A or even Demon Lord Walk in certain contexts would probably help you a lot more for keeping opponents off of you, and a lot more afraid of trying to recklessly hop in if they're actually trying to think about it. That also can put you into a fun situation where if your opponent isn't willing to engage you very much because they're afraid of eating Demon Lord Walk and they just want to sit back and throw projectiles, you can then do C Demon Lord Walk to neutral skip and go to them. So, something to think about. And then pointing out the usage of Chain Gang there, where you only really got a handful of hits with it that didn't really do a whole lot. So examining why you're using Chain Gang, what purpose it serves in your kit, is something I would, again, point at. And maybe consider swapping it either for a different alt skill or a different skill in general, or maybe swapping it out to use for more meter-consuming cards in your deck, because another thing I could point out is you weren't really using your meter very much throughout the entire set. You had a handful of card uses, but nothing really low commitment or nothing to really like frame trap or tack on a bit of extra damage in some combo situations. So, and I did appreciate the reversal attempt. That was reasonable, but unfortunately you just guessed wrong in that situation. C'est la vie, we move on with those kinds of things. We take the L on that kind of shit. Okay, I think that's that for thinking there. I am going to take a brief break, and then I'm going to come back with a replay of my own, more from the perspective of a player that I played with. So I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Alrighty, let's move on to the last replay that I've got here. So this one is more so just a kind of a means to point out some of how I go through the replay review process when I examine a lot of stuff, and to be a little more specific about explaining things, mostly how I look at exchanges and how they work. The replay itself is not super interesting, but it's mostly just to provide an example for solo replay review stuff. So let's hop into this. This is myself playing versus a Mei Ling player, and I want to try to take the opportunity to point out self-critical stuff and ways that I examine how situations play out. But that's okay. All right, let's begin. So pause, put our display on, slow the game down a bit. All right, let's take a look here. So round start here, as typical with how I tend to approach this stuff, I take a very neutral, safe option where I sit at mid-screen, as my general game plan tends to resolve around playing within that sweet spot of 5B, far 5A range. So I simply hold space, walk backwards, and wait to see what my opponent does. My opponent super jumps at me, and as a Mei Ling, does the funny. So we just block it, because it's not particularly scary. No big deal. Deal with their offense to see what they can do. Age check because I'm an old man. Get hit for a guard crush combo that really doesn't do anything, so I don't care too much. Age check, of course I'm an old man. Eat a prorated combo that isn't particularly dangerous. Now this is something that, in context, was extremely funny. This showed that my opponent wasn't knowledgeable or very capable of playing around weather. As in the situation, when you have Diamond Dust, your goal number 1 should be scoring a knockdown in order to tack on the extra 500 damage and to try and force your opponent into a situation where you can run things like 50-50s or really, really frustrating offense that you can't simply tech out of. This is something that Sakuya players love seeing Diamond Dust, because they get to run their Okizeme and you cannot tech out of it. And it sucks for you as the defender. So seeing this taught me that, well, my opponent isn't paying attention to weather, so I need to be more mindful of leveraging weather against them. So I tech out, I do my very simple tech back. I unfortunately don't recognize the wrong spacing. If I was to do that in the future, I would have hit the button, recognized the spacing, done an air dash to try to correct my facing, or simply just fall to the ground and let the opponent air tech. I get hit with the cross up. We air tech because the opponent isn't very careful with that. We go for the default dial A because I haven't shown. We pass over. Try to catch them jumping out. Catch them forward escaping forwards with the J2A reset. We set up the funny. Do the cross up. This is another case of object permanence being a very critical thing. I specifically spaced out those 2 projectiles in order to act as cover for when I try to J2A in, because my intention was to try and catch them dashing out of it. They blocked and decided to mash on the whiffed J2A instead of simply blocking. Combo. I whiff because I was out of practice at the time. This is simply something I need to work on. Walk out of the corner. Button to nothing. Get hit by the air option. They gave me plenty of time to buttons. Break because they aren't being mindful of their spirit, and we just walk forwards. So, it's important to note in that situation, Okizeme could have been possible, and that hinged entirely on the Mei Ling player teching forwards into space. I wasn't necessarily willing to take that risk, but rather than simply sit at max range and wait, I decided to walk forward slowly in order to react to see what the Mei Ling player would do. And in this case, they chose to dash forwards without setting anything. So, we jump over. Unfortunately, this Mei Ling player is very willing to hit air buttons, so I get tagged. They whiff it. Button. Air button. I get hit trying to be non-thinking. Try to catch them with far 5A on their way down. I fuck it up. We get them with the reset. I whiff the combo. This is very much on me at this exchange. I chose to push 5B instead of either blocking or doing 2C. This is It's mainly my brain autopiloting, pushing buttons. So it's something I need to keep in mind going forward, is I need to be a little more mindful of the situations I'm dealing with. No real follow-up. Unfortunately, I try to F5A rather than jump J5A. That's entirely on me. I need to be more mindful of that when I'm dealing with these anti-air situations. Get tagged for basically nothing. Tech in space because their spacing is very bad and they're not representing Okizemi. Wrong block, projectile, projectile. In that situation, since it was projectile to projectile, there was enough of a gap that I could have dashed through that. That is something that I like to point out when dealing with offense. By nature of how grazing functions within Soku, you need to make sure that if you are doing projectile into projectile, there is no gap whatsoever. If there is ever a gap and your opponent is aware of it, they can simply dash out, and if you do not have some kind of melee skill to follow up to make yourself safe, or you are unwilling to, you will simply die. Block, border escape out, walk in, I try to button, get tagged by the funny, dash, hit the button, try to catch me jumping, get tagged, There's the rainbow ring. I fail to change my block mid-flight, which I should have simply either blocked or waited on. So let's move on to the next round here. Try to hold space. Follow up. So my decision for playing at this space is largely because this melee player's decision making is to go in and go in fast. All the time, no breaks. When I get to sit at a longer range and wait, I have a lot more time to react to what my opponent is doing. This is a very critical part of playing neutral, and why I often tend to point at the video from PC Volt that up back is not playing neutral. This specifically ties into an important discussion about the action economy and time spent to complete objectives. Ideally speaking, you want to be spending the least amount of time trying to achieve an objective when playing a fighting game, be that pushing offense, trying to maneuver, or simply attacking an opponent. When you jump back, you have to consider the time spent committing to the jump, the movement backwards, and then you have to consider the commitment to dashing forwards and the time spent in the movement required to get to your opponent, then the startup of your option, and then the option connecting. In that amount of time, if an opponent is playing passively or reactively, they generally have the time to see that you are going for that and to prepare an according option. This actually gets into a fairly dense article that I like to reference a lot of time. The Machabo... what was the full title for this again? Yeah, the Machabo Fundamentals for Those Wanting to Become Good at Guilty Gear. It, funny enough, actually covers a lot of general fighting game stuff, and this is something I can provide as a link if people want it. But the main point I'd like to talk about here is the learning neutral game using the 3 structure. This is actually covered in Krakatoa's video neutral.mp4, which is another video I would recommend people want to watch if they want to explore this idea more, where we are examining the idea of playing passively, playing preemptively, and establishing offense. So generally what this would look like is playing passively is sitting back and waiting. Preemptive is putting offensive attacks out, and establishing generally is reacting to what the opponent is doing, if I remember my words correctly. It's a very specific triangle of options beating options. If we look at the thing here, if I pull out the number here, so if we are, so our passive play beats preemptive because we are putting something out when we are spotting an opponent doing stuff. Our reactive play is being beat by preemptive play because an opponent... Oh, fuck, I'm fucking up the example. I'm so smart at this. And I'll just link the Krakatoa video. I'm so fucking bad at this when I get caught in the spot. Whatever. Lack of rehearsal moment. Let's fucking go. Alright, so I choose bad options. I get tagged for it. Run out of the corner because the melee player isn't doing much. I get tagged by Earthquake. simply jump over. I choose a poor option for that. Another just for trying to far 5A to anti-air, but getting 5A instead and just kind of rolling with it. Anti-air, do the bounce. I flub up my combo. Convert into some damage. Go for a graze button. Age check, I block wrong. I mash on that because I'm not thinking. Could have absolutely dashed out, chose not to. Jump. I missed the inversion. That. Block wrong. Border escape out to reset my spirit. Have a funny whiff moment with the combo because getting frustrated, I messed up with that, and then they don't have the object per means to remember that there are B projectiles on top of them, and they get tagged trying to mash on wake up. Sucks. So the main thing that I would have noticed in that round is a lot of combo drops, which is just practice my combos more, very simple stuff, and being very impatient on defense through doing a bunch of mashing that probably didn't need to be done. I need to work on that. Coming opens with a combo thing, we both in the air around start. It's worth noting that I am still playing on layer 0 very, very ignorantly right now, where my mindset is simply far 5A and 5B. This is a thing that I talk about a lot. Whenever I am playing Soku, I am functionally playing Guilty Gear Strive Sol Bad Guy, where I am pushing far slash at you at every opportunity. My entire game plan is far 5A, 5B. We whiff and we simply block the super, because that's safe. I make a bad choice, not assuming they're going to dash up and do a button. Block the air, simply get out. Be aggressive, put a make sure they get tagged by the bullet to then put a box on top when they tech. Expect them to go in for a button, mash on the thing to trade, doesn't matter. Catch them on the anti-air, pull up my confirm. They aren't establishing their offense very well, so I have a lot of space to simply mash out and not give a shit. Anti-air projectile, wait for them to approach. Get them consistently trying to move out. Super confirm. Damage. What do we do for Okizemi? Process. Easy. Alright. So that just about covers everything that I was hoping to go for. So the main thing to point out with my own personal replay review was mostly being critical of decisions that I made, and keeping in mind options that were presented. A main thing that I can point out for self-criticism there was not making active use of other options I had in my toolkit. For example, in a lot of the offense situations I was in, I had access to default 2-2X. I could have used 2-2B or 2-2C for varying angles on shooting, as well as free jump movement. There's other things like not properly anti-airing in a lot of situations, where I made the decision to try and hinge on far 5A functioning instead of simply doing a neutral jump 5A to catch a lot of the situations where the mailing player was jumping at me. There's other things like being a little bit too unwilling to do Okizemi in some situations, where instead I simply waited, as the mailing player was far more willing to simply mash or do something, and I felt I could take more advantage of that situation rather than simply presenting a flat frame trap situation. There's a lot of things that could have been done better in that replay. So, I think that just about covers everything that I wanted to do here for the replay review session here. Mix of submissions and my own there for the final bit there with some commentary there. I hope that for those of you who joined us, this was helpful for you or meaningful in some way to show the process and talk about it. I definitely flubbed a few things here just from a lack of doing this before, but I hope that in the future being able to do this a few more times might help both myself and others with the replay review process and showing things out here. If anyone has any further questions about stuff that happened on stream, by all means hit me with an @ in the Soku channel in the 12.13 Hisoutensoku server. I will be glad to answer questions or talk further about replay stuff. If you want additional replay review for sets provided, by all means, I can sit down and look through more stuff. I will always be able to find the time whenever I'm available to do review and coaching and stuff like that. Yeah, otherwise, unless there's any particular questions from people in chat, if chat is even functioning for me on stream here, I will probably call it for now here, as my voice kind of hurts. Alright, well, if nothing there, then I'm going to call it for today. I appreciate those of you who joined us for watching this. Thank you very much for your time, and a big thank you to the people who provided replays for the review session here. I will try to make this VOD available on my YouTube channel for watching in the future, as I think this will probably be very helpful for referencing for a few people. With that, I hope the rest of you have a great day, and thank you for coming.